Talion peered out at Silas, now with this long, billowing white cloak flowing from his form. Again, there began to be a massive pull of air as Talon opened his mouth, pulling in a large gust of air to breathe another spout of fire. As he did, Silas rapidly wrapped himself in the cloak, all of it billowing down, moving around him. And just as before, as Talon opened his mouth once again, a massive white bolt of fire shot from it, confined, and yet as it continued, widened into an endless gout of fire, streaking towards Silas, who this time did not move or dodge. As the bolt impacted, there was a massive explosion, sending rock and earth flying everywhere. Fire encompassed the entire area, red-hot heat everywhere, and a mountain of flames consuming everything, stretching up for hundreds of feet, smoke billowing from the location, as rubble, both large and small, clattered to the ground everywhere. As that massive wall of flames burned into the sky, Talon looked upon the destruction and roared fiercely, once again shaking the ground and peering into that mountain of flame to assure that the prey had been vanquished. As the flames burned, for a moment Talon's stance began to lax, growing less tense as he peered in. And then suddenly, there was a sound from within that forest of flames, that towering mountain of fire, a sizzling that grew louder and louder, as suddenly a tsunami of water poured from it, spreading over the fire, putting it out all around, swirling, moving seemingly of its own accord, as if it were controlled by some other natural force. In but a few moments, the entire mountain of fire that Talion had spit had been doused, burning no more, as all but smoke was left, a few scattered stones still steaming, as that whirling tsunami of water poured back in towards the center. And there stood Silas, that long, billowing white cloak flowing. As all the water poured into his direction, it seemed to dissipate into that thick white fog, reabsorbing back into the cloak. "Nice try, kid," Silas said. "Well, I'll let you get first strike. Now it's my turn," Silas said as he dashed forward. With inhuman speed, his foot only touched the ground for a moment. After that, it was as if he was flying, leaving a streak of fog behind him, at first dashing directly for Talon, but then suddenly changing direction, whirling around him in a wide circle, still leaving that streak of fog that seemed to spread out, filling the entire area. Talon breathed in for a moment, and then began spitting bolts of fire, one after another, out towards this figure flying around. But it looped around, ducking and dodging, as one bolt after another flew by, impacting the ground around them, exploding in gouts of fire, much smaller than the first two, but still more than strong enough to cause immense explosions. And then suddenly, it was as if the fog itself came alive. Foggy skeletal figures began to emerge one after another. At first dozens, and then hundreds. An army of skeletons, all with a foggy shape to them. Small amounts of fog drifting off of their form as they pulled themselves from the fog surrounding him and began to rush towards Talion's location. The first few dozen skeletons were quickly obliterated. Talion swept up on them, and with a single swing of his tail, or a slash of the claws on his hands, they would be completely destroyed, leaving only wisps of fog in their place. Talon's speed was incredible, the power of his strikes immense. If he struck downward, he would actually tear large grooves into the ground. One after another, these skeletons fell, destroyed in endless procession, as Talon furiously swept through them. But after a few moments of doing this, Talon seemed to rush back towards the center, seeing all the countless skeletons moving in his direction, all funneling in towards the center where he stood, his eyes darting between them rapidly. Once again, Talon looked up towards the sky, breathing in a gout of air, and this time, turning his attention directly towards the ground beneath him. Suddenly, he opened his mouth, and a stream of fire poured forth from it that began to spread. This blast wasn't concentrated like the first two, or in bolts like the following sequence of bursts that he let out. No, it seemed to be far less concentrated, but much more steady and still in an overwhelming amount. The fiery spues spread out, filling the entire area. Suddenly, the skeletons began to dissipate by the hundreds, now being burnt away in an ocean of flame. Talon standing there at the center as he finished breathing it, unfazed by the fire surrounding him. As he began to peer up out of the fire, looking at these figures still floating around in the air. For a moment, Salus stopped, just floating there in the air, looking down at Talon. Okay, so just because you've gone down to instincts doesn't mean you're stupid. You can still solve problems, can't you? Well, let's see how you solve this. Salus raised his hand, and with a sweeping motion, all of the fog that he had left in the area began to shift, turning into water and starting to swirl out, round and round, circling Talon as it moved in towards his location. A wall of spinning water in all directions, moving in. Eventually, it all poured in on him at once. The water built up, stacking on top of itself, after putting out the fire, forming a sphere around Talon, about 50-foot wide sphere of water. And there Talon was at the center, simply swimming in it. At first, he attempted to swim out, and surprising as it is, he was a very rapid swimmer. But no matter how hard he tried to swim out, it was as if some force kept pulling him back towards the center of the sphere, unable to move, unable to leave this watery place, unable to breathe submerged in it. Sorry if this is a little underhanded, kid, but I suppose if you don't have air, you're gonna have to fall unconscious eventually. Even dragons breathe. There, Talon sat at the center, struggling, flailing about as if he was trying to get out, but unable to. Not much longer now, Silas said to himself. He should be going out any time now, he said to himself, floating there in air, watching the sphere of water. And then suddenly, what looked like a massive whirlpool began to form in the sphere of water as it began to shrink down bit by bit, rapidly coalescing down to basically nothing. And there at the center, the whirlpool focused down, and Silas could see that it was all flowing into Talon as he swallowed all the water up in a whirlwind of flurried wind and water, all of it gathering and disappearing down his throat as he slammed his mouth shut. No more water holding him aloft in the air, he fell to the ground, landing on his feet. And once again, Salus heard a sound, a large gulp, as Talon swallowed it down. Suddenly, the fog around his form began to thicken, growing heavier. Talon's fog-like form grew even larger, more immense than it was before, now covering even his tail, and the size of his body grew. more than 10 times its size, now completely immersed in fog. The horns that protruded from his head no longer visible in their physical state, but now this fog-like form had taken them on as well, billowing white horns of fog taking shape in its form.